Entering the Mayo Experience.
Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience. Time is here. Week 1 DraftKings picks and preview giant Millionaire Maker contest on the go on DraftKings. On the weekend, there's a $3 contest, which is super huge. So what we did, we rounded up the best in the biz, or at least 2 of the best in the biz from dailyroto.com, both co-founders, to break down this entire Millionaire Maker slate. So no Thursday nighter, no Monday night games, the main slate on Sunday, and that doesn't include the Sunday night game either. So just the early and late afternoon games. It is Drew Dinkmeyer and Mike Leone from dailyroto.com. Drew, did I get that right? All the games that are included and aren't? I feel like I should know this. I feel like I should know this, but I always forget.
You did. No Thursday, no Sunday night, no Monday night. Gotta save those showdown and primetime slates for what they are. And the main slate is just those Sunday afternoon games.
All right, so Mike, are you excited for week 1 or what? Because you guys at Daily Roto have everything on the go right now. I even saw you have ceiling projections now.
Yeah, I've been working very hard on those, so happy to get those out. You can see percentile outcomes for all players, and I'm very excited for week 1. I'm ready for it to be here and get through this grind scramble of a week. It's kind of crazy just getting everything together, but it's a fun crazy, but I am looking forward to lineups locking on Sunday and hopefully watching myself win money.
Before we get into each position, we'll go position by position. So if you want to hit the description and jump to the position of your choice, that's your prerogative. They all count as clicks for me. So if you just want to jump around, click, 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 that's like 6 views. That's amazing. That's exactly what you should be up to at this point. But I'm going to be giving away 20 DK dollars on next Monday's show. Plus, I'm going to have a live chat this Sunday morning on the DraftKings YouTube channel, 10 a.m. So be here for that. That'll be running all the way till 11:30 a.m. until the DraftKings Boston guys take over from 11:30 till 1 for lineup lock with the sweat. You can check that out on the YouTube channel and on the DraftKings Facebook feed. So a little tip on there. Remember, subscribe to the audio podcast so you can just listen to one, watch the other one, double the clicks. But if you want to get in the draw for 20 DK dollars, step 1. Give the episode a like. Step 2, leave your DraftKings name in the handle, or in the comment section, your DraftKings handle in the comment section. My bad. And then give me your favorite play from under $4,000 on the DraftKings main slate. I don't want to hear about your Monday night picks or your Thursday night picks. Main slate only, the Millionaire Makers slate only, because that's what we're talking today. That's how you get in the draw. Plus, there's a giveaway from Monday's show I did with Jake Seeley on the rankings about Instagram. You go check that out. I have a video up there. You give the account to follow. You give the quick heart to the picture of me. Well, not me sitting at the desk, just this desk. Leave your DK handle in the comment section. Boom, you're in a 20 DK dollar draw as well. Plus, if you use the promo code ThePME on Daily Roto, get yourself 10% off. It's what I'm using. It's what Paul Shag behind the camera's using. I'm pretty sure it's what Drew and Mike are using. I'm not confirmed on that, but I'm guessing that's the case. So 10% off with the promo code ThePME. Let's talk running backs. You guys ready to do this?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
All right, very top of the pricing list for the week, we have Le'Veon Bell against Cleveland. He's $9,400. He's followed by David Johnson at 88. And then we drop down into Alvin Kamara at 85, Elliott at 7.7, Fournette at 7.1, Hunt at $6,900. Nice. Melvin Gordon, 68, Saquon Barkley, 67, Christian McCaffrey, 64, Dalvin Cook, 62, Joe Mixon, 6,100, and LaShawn McCoy, 6,000. That's your $6,000 and up range. So I guess, Drew, first up, what do you do with Le'Veon Bell? Because this situation, as we speak right now, has not been resolved. We don't know if he's going to show up. We don't know if he's going to play. Let's say he does show up, and let's say he is active. He had 13 touches week 1 against Cleveland last season. He's the most expensive player at the running back position. This just screams he's going to be like 3% owned regardless of what happens if he plays. But does that mean you should still play him?
It's a tricky situation because, you know, the last few years Le'Veon has done this, and when he's returned, he's gotten the bulk of the carries, but last year they went kind of pass heavy in week 1, and then week 2 and week 3 he saw all the carries in the world. Cleveland's rush defense is a little bit improved over the last few seasons, so it's not the greatest matchup in the world. It's still a good matchup as, you know, a road favorite with a hefty implied total. It's a really big price tag, as you said. Nobody's going to play him. So I think this decision is ultimately going to come down to, in GPPs, do you view the ceiling of Le'Veon Bell as higher than the ceiling of some of the other higher priced guys. And that's where, Mike with the floor and ceiling projections can kind of come in. And we're now scaling back his workload a little bit because James Conner's been so impressive in the preseason. So I probably won't have a ton of Le'Veon Bell at this price tag. The real key news will be if Le'Veon Bell doesn't suit up, then I think James Conner will become the ultra chalk of the slate and one of the highest owned players overall.
So last season, Mike, when we were in this situation with Le'Veon Bell coming off the holdout, he still played 72% of Pittsburgh's offensive snaps in week 1. It just didn't materialize into any touches. So what do you make of Bell if he plays? And is James Conner at $4,500 like a lock play? Or is like Jalen Samuel something you should start looking at?
So if Bell plays, some of this depends on the news that we'll get out of Pittsburgh. When he actually ends up reporting to practice, I think makes a big difference. If you report it's Wednesday, gets in the Wednesday through Friday practices, it's different than, he reports Friday and they get him in. And then at that point, you would expect the touches to be scaled back. But if he gets a full week of practice in, the ceiling's going to be there. We have him scaled back to around 60 to 70% of the team's carries right now. And even with that, he's got a top 5 ceiling in the flex position just because of the way he contributes across the board in the passing game. In terms of market share touchdowns, you got a pretty good team total there. But if he's out, I think Conner becomes that chalk play that we talked about when we did that preview show, me, you, and Drew before, where we said, sometimes when you've got a cheap running back in a smash spot, that's where you can completely eat the chalk. And I think Conner would do that. So over the last few seasons, backup running backs for Pittsburgh have averaged something like 20 fantasy points per game when Bell's been out because they still give them that bell cow role. And I think Conner would step in and get, maybe not the 80+% market share that Le'Veon Bell's getting. But if you put him anywhere 65 to 70% of the carries and rush touchdowns, start to give him 10 to 15% of the team's targets, he becomes an outlier strong play.
So do you think that Jalen Samuels just plays no role in this whatsoever? Because he's $3,000. That if you were to divvy it up a little bit or all of a sudden they just swerve and say, hey, Samuels, you're the man here right now. We think that you're better served for this, where Connor's just more of a change of pace backup. Now, he hasn't shown that. That is not the outcome that I would expect to happen. But do you think that's on the table at all, Mike?
I don't really think that's on the table. I guess if that'd be more of a reason to fade Conner, if you just think he's absurd chalk and you're worried a little bit about Samuels, but I don't see any way where I'm using Samuels unless we just hear some reports and my mind really changes. I don't know if Drew feels differently, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Drew, same question to you. And when Mike brings up market share and he talks about the percentage of snaps that a running back is going to play, what would you say is a high-end bell cow market share for a running back? Over 80% of the offensive snaps, over 75%, that range?
Yeah, so snaps, it's going to be over 75%. When we talk about market share, we're often talking about rush attempts or touchdowns in general. So a market share of rush attempts for a bell cow is typically, in the high 60s, low 70s, and then a target share of 10% or greater. And those are the true bell cow backs that can really contribute in any game script and any game format. So in this case, what we've seen from Pittsburgh in the past, they've used the backup. Usually it's been D'Angelo Williams in the past as kind of that bell cow back where they're in for 70+% of snaps. They're getting, around 70% of the carries, high 60s, and they're getting that market share of the targets as well. Jalen Samuels was kind of like a utility player in college where he played a little bit of tight end, a little bit of halfback, a little bit of kind of wing back lining up. And he's very useful in a lot of different roles, but he wasn't often a bell cow in college. So I think James Conner would operate in that role if Le'Veon Bell was out, and I think he would be the primary.
All right, so just quick one-word answer. We get Bell is playing. We hear this news on Friday afternoon. You project the ownership to be sub 5% on Le'Veon Bell in the Millionaire Maker. Drew, are you playing him?
I'm probably playing 10% at that point of a ton of lineups. So
one word answer.
Yeah, sorry, 10%.
Mike?
Yes.
Yes. If you were only playing, let's say, 5 lineups, Mike, would you play him?
Yes.
Drew?
No.
Okay, I'm sorry. I wanted to be on the fade train anyway, just with the Steelers being on the road, him being so expensive, and when we drop down and we see David Johnson and Alvin Kamara next, I like Bell a lot in this situation. I mean, I wish Gurley was on this slate, but I like Kamara the best objectively of any of these running backs, regardless of price. And I think that David Johnson's a very close second because you talk about game flow. And yeah, maybe Kamara could deal with game flow issues a little bit if they want to say, hey, we're up by a ton, let's give Mike Gillisley the ball. But he absolutely pounded as a giant favorite last year, and he pounded Tampa Bay in these situations. And David Johnson, there's just no game script that you can write him out of. And it always seemed like people were going to lean Bell over Johnson. Now that's not going to be the case. So of those top three guys, Mike, who is your overall favorite? Which one will you own the most of?
My overall favorite's David Johnson, and I think I'll own the most of David Johnson because I believe Kamara is going to be the chalkiest of the group. So I have it just slightly flipped. I think both are really strong plays. If you're playing cash games, there's some merit to trying to get both in. You might have to decide on just one. But I have DJ1 with Kamara a close second. And the thing with Kamara is he projects really well, even if you expect the efficiency regression. That's almost certainly going to hit him. With Mark Ingram out, though, you're anticipating some increase in workload. They didn't do that a whole ton last year. We're not sure if that workload for him, are they just going to keep him in his role and have Boston Scott, maybe Mike Gillisley step in and split that Mark Ingram side of things. So I just value the pure volume of DJ more and his elite talent in the receiving game. I think it's at Frisco Josh on Twitter has like this air yards model. If you look at just his receiving stats for David Johnson, he has him as a wide receiver 2 or something. Like that's how awesome he is through the air. So I'm on Team DJ as my favorite of the top plays for tournaments.
Drew, what are you doing with these top three guys? And do you think it's necessary to build at least around one of these three?
I wouldn't. So in like a cash game perspective, I would say it's necessary to build one of the two of David Johnson and Kamara. I'd throw Le'Veon Bell out from a cash game perspective. In tournaments, I think there's so many different values throughout the mid-tier of the running backs that it's not necessary to have one of these two guys in your lineups by any means. But I do think they are heads and tails in terms of total raw projection ahead of the field at the running back spot. Mike alluded to the differences between the two players. Kamara gets there a little bit more from a projection standpoint through efficiency and through his team situation, whereas DJ gets there through both volume. I feel better about Kamara's floor slightly in cash games simply because the team situation is so good and the opportunity for the increased volume is there. And with David Johnson, the matchup is really good. Washington was one of the weakest teams against the run last season, but Washington's defense was also really banged up last season. Zach Brown missed a lot of time or was playing injured. Jonathan Allen missed a lot of time. Mason missed a lot of time. So their defense should be healthier and better this year. And my one concern on David Johnson is just so much of that offense is dependent on him that if he's not going to get a lot of opportunities from the rest of the offense kind of helping him out. That being said, I think one of those two would for sure be in my cash game lineups. And I think in many of my tournament lineups, I would have one of those two. But there's a lot of good plays at running back. If you're playing a few lineups, I wouldn't say you have to have one in every single lineup that you're building.
All right, so you mentioned, Drew, that there's a bunch of good values at the running back position. Before we get into the guys that are cheap and where you can save money, from the $6,000 to $8,000 range, you got Zeke in there, you got Christian McCaffrey in there, you have Joe Mixon in there, who inherits a really sweet matchup up against the Colts. Melvin Gordon in what it projects to be a very high-scoring game, at least from the Chargers side, when you look at a lot of the team totals. So what do we do from here? Because it doesn't seem like anyone's going to play Barkley up against the Jags. Kareem Hunt, people are kind of like, on, although he killed the Chargers twice last season. Who is the play from this range that you're most interested in?
I think the highest probability plays in this range are Melvin Gordon and Christian McCaffrey. Those are the two guys that I'm most comfortable with, and those are the guys that would make my cash game consideration on kind of a short list as well. With McCaffrey, we saw all the increased volume in the preseason. We know the floor is so good because of the full PPR scoring on DraftKings. We know historically, the Cowboys have been a little bit weaker in coverage against running backs. So I think McCaffrey's in a very good spot himself. The only concern there would be if Dallas was able to really control the game offensively, but their injuries on the offensive line make me question whether they'll be able to do that and limit Carolina's plays. Gordon, high team total for the Chargers. It looks like the Chiefs defense is going to take a step back this year. They were kind of run all over in the preseason by opposing offenses. So really like those two. In terms of tournaments, the guy that I'm kind of most interested in this group is Dalvin Cook. We have all these workload concerns about Dalvin Cook coming back from ACL surgery, and I think those are legitimate. And I think it's going to push the ownership way down. Minnesota has an implied total of 26. They're home favorites. Dalvin Cook, when he was the starter last season, averaged over 23 touches per game before getting injured in the first half of the game against the Lions. He had 14 touches in the first half of that game, if you want to include that one as well. So he was a bell cow workhorse guy. If that happens, if we're wrong that they're going to scale back workload at all, he's got huge upside for a relatively cheap price tag in the low 6,000s in a matchup where his team has a higher implied total than most of the guys around him. Dalvin Cook's really interesting to me in tournaments.
What do you make of this range, Mike? Because your main man, Shady McCoy, is just $6,000, and now he's not going to be suspended. That news has come out. And this is a game where they could be trailing. I mean, they're massive underdogs against the Ravens. I mean, it opened at 6. It went up to 7. It might be up to 7.5 at this point now that Nate the Great Peterman's starting. But could this just be dump-off central for LaShawn McCoy? He could pick up like 8 catches?
It could be, and we didn't see a whole lot of Shady in the preseason. That between all the the stigma around the Bills that it's really going to be ugly, and it is going to be ugly for them both overall for the season and in this first game against Baltimore on the road. Peterman starting, shaky O-line. For all those reasons, I think he's going to go really low owned, but he's our 5th best projected running back value right now just because of the volume. Volume is the most important things, and that's with a 13.5% market share of targets. And you mentioned check down city. That 13.5%, that could grow. We did see last year they did kind of seem to cap Shady from getting these insane volume totals, but it was pretty consistently high. So I think, he's going to be a good play in tournaments as the guy that is going to project okay for everybody, but no one wants to use. Everybody finds an excuse to play somebody else. So I do think that's fine. And I also think Saquon Barkley's an interesting tournament play here. If Drew's going Dalvin Cook, I'll go Saquon Barkley as my guy. I do think there's some potential for increase in our projected volume for him. They drafted him 2 overall. He says he's completely healthy, ready to go after having that slight hamstring issue over the preseason. And Jacksonville does funnel targets to the running back position just because they're so dominant on the outside. So he could see a lot of dump offs as well. He's, the term generational talent gets thrown out a lot, but in Saquon Barkley's case, it does seem to apply. If you look at his athletic metrics, his production in college at Penn State. So I'm just really on him. There's always the chance too that this Jags defense, as strong as it looks, as healthy as it is, as many guys as they're returning, it could fall off a little bit. It could regress. They were at an elite level last season. Sometimes it's just hard to maintain that. And those are the things week 1 sometimes that we just automatically assume carry over from one year to the next that doesn't necessarily come to fruition.
So what do you make of these bigger names that no one really seems super interested in? Like you say Barkley's one of these tournament plays potentially coming in at the low ownership, but it doesn't seem like a ton of people are going to own Zeke against Carolina. You mentioned the concerns that come along with the offensive line. It's not a great matchup anyway on paper, especially if a negative game script occurs and he doesn't get involved in the passing game. Then you're really relying on rushing yards and touchdowns, and there could be limited opportunities in that spot. But like Kareem Hunt and Leonard Fournette are 2 guys that no one super seems interested in. Are they just too expensive and you'd rather take the shot on someone like Dalvin Cook or LaShawn McCoy?
So Zeke I'm off of. I just think it's not a great spot for him. And the price tag too at $7,700. If I'm taking a chance on Barkley, $6,700, that's a big difference. When you start climbing up to price tags that are getting close to DJ and Kamara, if I'm not using DJ Kamara, I'm probably constructing differently. I'm not finding a straight line pivot off of them, even if it's a little bit cheaper. You look at Fournette, that's kind of interesting. You compare him to Christian McCaffrey. If you project a lot more ownership on Christian McCaffrey, I think Christian McCaffrey is the much higher floor. No running back has a higher projected market share of targets for us this week. But with Cam Newton in the red zone soaking up a lot of the touchdowns for Carolina, he kind of falls behind Leonard Fournette in our really high-end ceiling projections because Fournette just has the higher touchdown upside. So I can see him. It's a situation of, how narrow of a player pool do you really want, though? So I think, Fournette's usable for me. Zeke's probably a guy I'm going to full fade or very close to it.
Okay, so Drew, in this $5,000 area, when we drop down and we just get below LaShawn McCoy, there's a few interesting names, but it seems like a lot of people are taking a hard pass on this entire range. So we first go to Kenyon Drake at $5,900. You have Alex Collins at 56 in a good spot against Buffalo as a big favorite against what was, gave up the 31st most, or gave up the second most, DraftKings points to running backs a year ago. Derrick Henry, Lamar Miller, and that's really it because Sony Michel is questionable in this situation, and Geis is obviously out. Is there anyone there? Because I really like the Alex Collins and Baltimore defense stack to try to correlate myself a little bit, but I guess it comes down to what you think that Alex Collins can do in, maybe it's not even the receiving game, but if he does have a total lock on the rushing attempts and the goal line attempts, why isn't he a good play in this spot?
So I think and this carries over to a lot of my season-long drafting as well, because I have a ton of Javorius Allen in season-long, like best ball leagues where he was going kind of in the last few rounds. The thing that has happened consistently, both last season, in the preseason as well, is Javorius Allen is on the field often. Like Alex Collins isn't getting those 70+% snap rates. He's getting kind of in the mid 50s. And with Javorius Allen on the field so much and Alex Collins kind of limited in the passing game, you need extreme efficiency. And the concern here for me is just that last year, if you look at the goal line opportunities as well, they were split between Javorius Allen and Alex Collins. So you are a little bit betting on the come if you assume that Alex Collins is the guy for sure. We didn't see it in the preseason. They were on the field the same amount of time with the ones. We didn't see it last year at all. So for a guy that doesn't catch passes, you really need insane efficiency and workload. And the opportunity's there against a Bills run defense that struggled last year, against a Bills offense that projects as below average and probably will have limited time possession. So I think it's a situation where Collins has the kind of upside in the matchup, but I don't love the price tag. And so I'm kind of stuck because I'm not projecting him to be, the 25 touch guy. I'm projecting him to be more like the 16 to 20 touch guy with most of those coming on the ground. And that's where it becomes like a price issue for me. The guy that I'm interested in there is Lamar Miller, who, the Patriots have often struggled against pass catching running backs. Their linebackers struggle in coverage. The only concern I have for Lamar is just that the Texans' offensive line looks like it's going to be one of the weaker units in the league. And if they need Lamar Miller to help out blocking, that would limit the amount of routes run and kind of the upside in the passing game. But I think a lot of people are going to look to that New England-Houston game for game stacks because it has the highest total on the board. But I think Lamar Miller is going to be the one piece that's kind of under-owned in that situation because I think people are going to play the Texans passing side and people are going to play, the Patriots all over the place. But Lamar Miller is kind of interesting to me as a piece of those game stacks as well.
Mike, do you like Miller more than you like the other guys in this range? Because would you gamble that, hey, all of a sudden Adam Gase is just like, you know what, Kenyon Drake is our best back. Let's give him 25 touches.
I'm with Drew. I prefer Lamar Miller of this bunch. I think he's the guy that's most likely to get the volume in all three facets that you want to see, even if it's not like elite level workhorse back. I think he's the guy who's most likely to have market share carries, market share of goal line opportunities, market share of receptions. That is most favorable combination of these three. And with Collins, too, to reiterate, I just hate betting on guys that, really you're counting on the small sample efficiency, which was really good for Collins. He was great, but we kind of just sometimes assume that efficiency is going to continue. And, he doesn't really have the athletic pedigree. He doesn't have the draft capital to back that up. So, and the other thing too, is I just think the ownership is going to be somewhat here. This is going to be like a 10% play. That's what we've got projected for him right now. If it was going to be a really low own play, I could be on board just because the projected game script. But if you're giving me a guy who's going to be near double digits, who doesn't contribute in the passing game, and you're counting on efficiency, at that point, I'm just kind of out.
Sub $5,000, Chris Ivory kicks it off, so you probably don't want to play Chris Ivory at $4,900. That's what I'm calling my lock of the week, so you can thank me later for not playing Chris Ivory. Good fade. Below that, you got Ronald Jones, but Dion Lewis is there at $4,900. You have Chris Thompson at $47, along with Adrian Peterson at $47, up against Arizona. Breda against Minnesota, the hardest team to generate DraftKings points against as a running back, is only $4,600. Then you got Carlos Hyde at $47. You mentioned James Conner if Le'Veon Bell doesn't play. Chris Carson, tough matchup against Denver, but looks to be somewhat of a workhorse. He's $4,500. Royce Freeman on the other side of the ball against what is now not a great Seattle team. He's he's $4,500. If we did this show like 3 weeks ago, 80% of people would have played Rex Burkhead at $4,200. So I'm curious to know what you think about that. Peyton Barber is $4,100. If you project game flow being really bad for them, is it that big of a deal? Maybe he's involved in the passing game. So, Mike, what do you like from this $4,000 range? Who are the guys? Are you worried that Rex Burkhead's knee and potentially the return of Sony Michel could limit what his upside is?
So, the news that I've seen on Burkhead has been that they've been pretty cautious with him and that they're not really too concerned about the knee. They just sided on the air of caution, and they expect him to be a big part of the game plan. His ability to contribute in the passing game and by the goal line is so strong for a perfect team for that is really, lacking wide receiver depth, so can funnel targets to the running back position. They're going to have to be creative in who they spread targets to outside of Hogan and Gronk. And by the goal line, Burkhead really was the guy when he was healthy last year for them in that spot. So $4,200, the upside is just massive here. And I think even the floor, because of his receiving ability, is okay. Both him and James White can combine for 30% market share of the targets. That's not in a reasonable expectation for the two of them together. So they can both get their play in the receiving game. So I'm on Burkhead a lot in cash games. If he's massive chalk, it's not like a James Conner situation if Le'Veon Bell's out, where we feel so great about that workhorse role that we just smash him even at chalk prices. There are some spots to pivot. And as you were going through the guys, it's a lot of guys that if you've got strong takes on workload allocation, you can make cases for a lot of them. You got Carlos Hyde in this role, who we project pretty well in this $4,000 range. But you talk about Peyton Barber and some other guys that a lot of it comes down to where you're expecting the workload to line up. And the way we have it projected now is this tier just isn't that valuable for our workload expectations outside of Burkhead.
Drew, what do you see with Burkhead? Like, would you play some Burkhead lineups and then play some James White lineups because of what he could potentially be doing in the passing game? And what if Sony Michel plays? Does that throw just a grain of salt into the computer board a little bit, that it kind of fries everything and you don't really know what to do?
I think if Sony Michel plays, there's some reason for concern. But the way that I view this Burkhead situation is, the Patriots running backs, over the years have gotten the reputation of being somewhat unpredictable. But I think individual roles within the Patriots running back system seem to be easy to kind of pinpoint. Like James White's going to be the primary pass catcher, and then like in the hurry up, get some carries through that. Sony Michel is a guy who hasn't played in the preseason, hasn't practiced a ton in the preseason because of this knee injury. I can't imagine Bill Belichick's going to throw him into the Wolves right away in terms of pass protection. So I wouldn't expect any sort of passing down role for Sony Michel. I think one of Sony Michel or Jeremy Hill, whoever's active on game day, will potentially have some grind the clock down roles, or maybe around the goal line. But I think that leaves Rex Burkhead with that Dion Lewis, before Dion Lewis was the workhorse role towards the end of the season, with the upside of the Dion Lewis workhorse role if Michel or Hill are viewed as not viable candidates early in the season. So I think there's a lot of margin for error with Rex Burkhead at this price tag, because he's capable in the passing game, because he's capable around the goal line. He's been very successful in short yardage situations in his career, and because the team has such a high implied total and so much room for success. So I'm on Burkhead. I would not play Burkhead and White together in lineups personally. I think White is a fine pivot in GPPs that will come at lower ownership, especially on a full PPR site like DraftKings. And then the one guy in this area that I think is kind of interesting for GPPs is Royce Freeman, just because I think there's a chance the Broncos have been trying to hide him in the preseason, because they had that report that came out that like Devontae Booker was the starter. And then this week, one of the Broncos beat reporters was like, no, Freeman's going to start. If they're hiding Freeman and he's going to be like a bell cow right away, which I think is possible, at 4,500 with the public not exactly on him early because of some of the other values around him, I'm interested in Freeman in tournaments.
Okay, so would you go Freeman or Carlos Hyde?
I'd go Freeman personally. Hyde projects a little bit better for us because we know the role is more stable, and Hyde has shown a role in the passing game in the past. We know that he's going to be in on most first and second downs and third and like mediums, whereas Duke Johnson's going to be in on all the third and longs. But I think Freeman has the potential to be the bell cow. I don't think Carlos Hyde has that, because we know Duke Johnson's going to be in on all the third and long situations.
Would you go Freeman or Chris Carson in this spot?
I would go Freeman.
But don't we? I mean, I know the matchup for Royce Freeman is much better, but in terms of Chris Carson, don't we expect him? I mean, you can say that, it's potentially Denver's been hiding Royce Freeman and that he is the bell cow, but doesn't it just seem like Carson is the bell cow for Seattle right now?
Maybe I'm crazy, and maybe my CJ Procise affinity is carrying over far too long. But
I've tried this Procise thing before. It never really works out.
It doesn't work at all. It never works because his ankles give out. But I think when he's healthy, he's the third down back. He's the most adept pass catcher on the roster. So I think the passing game work for Chris Carson is limited. And that's what I just think there's a hint of upside with Royce Freeman, that he's in all situations on the better offense, or not the better offense, but in the better matchup at home. Whereas Carson, possibly better offense. I'm not sure Case. I mean, they have better supporting cast than Russ probably has, but I'm not sure Case greater than Russ just yet. I will say I like Freeman's role potential at the upside more than I like Carson's, because I do think CJ Procise is the third down guy.
Okay, so Mike, if we're playing pivot off of Rex Burkhead here, I actually think my preferred guy is Peyton Barber at $100 less.
Yeah, I mean, I can see Barber. The issue with Barber is, like, is he actually good? And, how much of a role is he going to have? But there's definitely room for increasing his projection. We've got him 53% market share of the rush attempts.
But who is taking this away from him? It's not going to be Ronald Jones. I mean, if that guy can rush to the bench, it's going to be the longest rush of his career.
So the way we have it shaking out right now for the running back position is you've still got some Jacquizz Rodgers there. We do think Ronald Jones plays a small role, and it's just enough to, hold him back a little bit. And we don't have Tampa Bay throwing a lot to the running back position to begin with. And it's a team that could be likely in a very negative game script. So even if you give him the bulk of the market share, we just don't have that being, super valuable in this spot, because you've got all these wide receiver weapons. You've got 2 tight end weapons for Tampa Bay. So we just don't have a lot of room for the running back targets. And I think that's what's holding Barber back. I don't think it's the worst play in the world. I'm with Drew, though. I think Freeman, I like Hyde too, but I think Freeman's kind of the play. I'm really down on Seattle. Earl Thomas is holding out. This defense is not what it used to be. I think Denver -2.5 is one of the better bets on the week at home. And I could just see the game script breaking great for Freeman. And as Drew said, there's just upside in him coming out right away week 1 and being the guy, when we're conservatively expecting him, to not be quite that involved.
Are you taking go ahead, Drew.
I was going to say, I do like Barber, especially since I like so many Saints this week. Like, I like Kamara, I like Michael Thomas a lot this week. I think Barber fits even in game stacks, because I don't think he's going to be the guy that people are going to use in game stacks if they stack Tampa Bay and New Orleans. I think people are going to look for Tampa Bay's passing game because they're going to figure Tampa Bay's playing from behind. Why would I want the running back in that situation? So, and if we're wrong on the market share of carries or the market share of targets, if we're wrong that Tampa Bay uses the backs more in the passing game than we're expecting, or if we're wrong in the sense that we think it'll be a little bit of a running back by committee situation, more so than we've seen in the preseason, simply because that's what they've historically done a little bit more, then there's upside there. And he's so cheap. You could stumble into a bell cow at 4K, even if it's a bad game script and bad situation. That's what keeps the ownership low. So similar to the things that I like about Freeman are there for Barber as well. We just don't have the projection. We have the projection a little bit muddled because we just don't have them passing the running backs a lot. But we could be wrong on that.
Well, one of the things that is really hard to gauge with this Tampa situation, I think, you got the Fitzmagic playing quarterback instead of Jameis. How does that change their offense, if it does at all? And then Charles Sims going to the IR, I think is somewhat important to see how many targets someone like Peyton Barber or Jacquizz Rodgers gets, because there was always sort of a myth around Rodgers that he was a receiving back, but whenever he's had a role on Tampa, it hasn't really worked out that way. Him and Barber sort of occupy the same space in the Tampa Bay offense. So it'd be, I think that, like, if we're going to take a gamble that Royce Freeman is the bell cow back on Denver, and I agree, that's a better situation to be in as favorites in a game where they could be up and just turn around and hand the ball off. If Peyton Barber can be the one on the field on these receiving downs, like, he could backdoor into 5-6 targets here.
Yeah, that's the way the upside gets achieved. I would be surprised if Peyton Barber had like 22 carries, 110 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I think the way Peyton Barber becomes a really great GPP play is if he's the guy that's involved in the passing game and they're playing from behind and they get all these free checkdowns that kind of burn the clock. And he ends up with some sort of line that looks like, 10 to 15 carries, 50 to 60 yards, and then has like 5 catches for another 40 yards and finds the end zone. That's when you kind of unlock the upside. So I'm with you on that play. I actually do like it as a part of bringing it back on the New Orleans stacks, hoping that New Orleans just goes nuts. And then Peyton Barber gets a bunch of checkdowns late.
Well, I guess the other thing, too, is with the way that they've played in the preseason, how he's been playing with the ones, and maybe this works for Royce Freeman as well. And I hate to keep using Royce Freeman as the example because you can throw Chris Carson into that mix, you can throw Adrian Peterson into that mix, doesn't matter who it is. Rex Burkhead as well. It does seem like if there's a best bet for a guy to take a handoff of those guys from the 3-yard line, it's probably Peyton Barber.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say Freeman and Barber and Carson probably all have really good touchdown equity. I think Freeman will have more opportunities in the game because I think their offense will be more successful.
All right, below $4,000, Mike, unless you really want to chat about like AP or Matt Breida, like those guys are sort of off the board a little bit, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was a report that Alfred Morris has been running with the 2s and that he was a bit behind on the playbook, which maybe they can get the Matt Breida juices going. There's certainly more upside for him as all-around back, as a higher upside back in terms of efficiency. But in this matchup against Minnesota is probably not the spot. I'm going to test that out.
All right, so who below this $4,000 area do you like at all? Like Jordan Wilkins could potentially start if Marlon Mack is out. He still has to contend with fantasy's main man, Christine Michael, and Nyheim Hines catching the ball out of the backfield. But again, this could be a situation where Wilkins looks good early. They just keep him in the game. You said Alfred Morris. He's only $3,600. Like, that's not crazy. He's not going to do anything in the receiving game, and you'd be hoping for like the Matt Asiata 3-touchdown game out of him. I'm not super interested, but I think that people will be based on what the expectation of his role in this offense, at least from a season-long perspective, how he's being talked up, that could translate into week 1. Do you have any interest in these guys?
I don't see much below 4K, honestly, that I dabble with. Morris is the only guy that I think I'd really consider. You've got Boston Scott for New Orleans right at 4K if you don't think Gillislee is involved at all and you think they don't want to extend, Kamara too much into the Ingram role. Like, I could kind of see that as a really long shot MME play, but certainly not someone that I'd be using if I was only making 5, 20, or probably even 50 lineups. That's like if you're full maxing and you want like a couple Boston Scott lineups. But I don't see much below 4K. I don't think you have to get that creative or I guess that stupid in making your lineups. I just don't think it's worth it. There's so many guys in the 4K that you can make really good arguments for based on workload. We talked about Freeman. There's Deion Lewis. There's Chris Thompson. There's so many guys that based on how you want to divvy up the workload, you can make good upside arguments for. You don't need to find the cap relief down sub 4K.
Drew, do any of these guys interest you? And I'll even throw in Mike Gillislee at 3,400 into that conversation.
No, Alf is the only guy, and to be honest, if a public's on him at all, I probably won't have a lot because I just don't. The upside, with Alf is really he has to score twice, and Minnesota's defense is so stout. So I'm in a situation where, like Mike, I run generally a tighter running back pool in general in my play. So these guys won't make the cut for me.
All right, before we move on to receivers, I do want to let everyone know if you're curious about how to construct your cores and how to do research, Mike, Drew, and I did a show right here on the DraftKings YouTube channel and on the Pat Mayo Experience from about a week and a half ago. You go back and look through it. DraftKings strategy for the year. So how do you condense your core? If you're playing 10 lineups, how many people should you really realistically be looking at for that? What type of tournaments to enter? How to do your research from step 1 to entering them. That's all up there right now, so go check that out. Receivers. Let's get into this because it's going to be a bit tougher. Antonio Brown is the highest at 8,600. DeAndre Hopkins is 8,300. Do you have a preference between one of those two, Drew? And do you think you can make lines with both of them? Would that be stupid? Would that be smart? Do you take the savings on Hopkins, and which one will be higher owned?
I think Hopkins is going to be higher owned. I think people are going to really want to attack that Houston-New England game because it has the highest total on the slate. And I think Antonio Brown is a much better GPP play as a result. I mean, you've got a lot of things working in Antonio Brown's favor with lower ownership. Le'Veon Bell kind of coming in late to the scene. Cleveland secondary, being a point of attack. I think Antonio Brown's a really, really good GPP play. And one of the reasons that I personally wouldn't have a lot of Le'Veon Bell is I'd rather have Antonio Brown for, $800 cheaper, who's been with the team all camp, who's, ready to go. Antonio Brown's one of my favorite high-end GPP targets at the wide receiver position.
What do you make of it, Mike?
I'm same as Drew. If Bell's at all limited, it opens up targets for Brown. We've got him at a 30% market share. At times at his peak, he's been 32, 33%. They've got more guys there now with Juju Smith-Schuster there. They've got James Washington, who they just drafted, who looks like he'll contribute, in that Martavis Bryant role right away. And, that brings him down to 30%. But all of a sudden, if you take Le'Veon Bell, who's like a 20% market share guy out, and Connor's more like 10 to 15%, that's a big deal. And the thing with DeAndre Hopkins is his volume was just so insane last year. He really wasn't that great, despite some really, fun highlight plays and stuff. If you really break it down on a per target basis, he wasn't that great. He was just racking up tons of targets. And that's obviously the most important aspect of things. But I don't think you expect him at 35% market share of targets again. So if you put him more like 30% market share of targets, all of a sudden, someone like Antonio Brown, who's much more efficient on a per target basis, just kind of blows him out of the water. But we actually have right now, with Le'Veon Bell expected to play most of the snaps, that still gives us Michael Thomas out projecting Antonio Brown by a little bit. And I think he's the guy to use in cash games. We have him with a ridiculously high catch total, more than half a catch projection higher than anyone else, because if you look at our team baselines, we project Breeze as the highest completion percentage in the league, and we project the Tampa Bay defense as allowing the highest completion percentage in the league. It's a domed game in New Orleans, super high team total. It just seems like a really good spot for Thomas. Maybe you're worried about like super high end upside if this game script just gets out of hand and they start, running a ton, which we did see at times last year. But you do have to count as well. Mark Ingram out. He was involved in the pass game as much as Kamara was involved in the passing game. You still had like 14% or so going to Ingram. And I don't think that's a part of the game that's going to be replaced by Boston Scott, going to be replaced by Mike Gillislee. And you're not going to take, Alvin Kamara up to a 25+% market share. So that gets spread around a bit more to the receivers as well, which helps solidify the amount of targets that you'd expect in a floor game for Michael Thomas.
So you're big on Thomas. The rest of the guys from $8,000 to $6,500. Right below him, you have Keenan Allen in a matchup which projects out really well. A.J. Green, Odell Beckham, probably the toughest matchup of the week. Thielen, Hilton, Evans, Larry Fitz, and Tyreek Hill in that same game. When people are playing game stacks, Drew, and they want to use the Chargers because they see, hey, it's a spot against a weaker Kansas City defense. I'm going to play a lot of Rivers. He's cheap. I'm going to pair him with Keenan Allen. Is Tyreek Hill the guy to bring back on the other side, even though the matchup is a bit gruesome? But we just know that it's one big play, and he's going to have the volume to back it up just a little bit.
I think it's really tough to figure out who you'd want to bring back on those Chargers stacks because the Chargers defense projects so well, and then all of the Kansas City guys are relatively expensive, the ones that you'd consider. I mean, Tyreek's at $6,500, Travis Kelce's at $6,400. You've got guys like, Stephon Diggs. You've got guys like Rob Gronkowski priced right around them that have much higher projections. So I think it's very difficult. I think the guy that I would probably bring it back with would be Kareem Hunt. In those situations, because when the Chargers were vulnerable last year, it was on the run defense and going on the road. First start of the season for Patrick Mahomes, tough environment. It's possible Andy Reid leans on the running game a little bit more with Kareem Hunt. So I think Kareem Hunt would be the guy that I'd bring it back. But obviously Tyreek Hill, even in a bad matchup, can make everything off in one play. He just has that kind of big play upside and that big play appeal. So he's okay. The public just tends to usually be on him. They're not, at least in our early ownership projections, which makes him a viable tournament play because of that upside. But I don't think I'm going to have a ton of KC on this slate. I think I'm going to like KC's offense a lot this year, but I really respect the Chargers defense. I think this is a really tough spot going on the road in the opener for Patrick Mahomes. So
from that $6,000 to $8,000 range at receiver, beyond Michael Thomas, who would be your 2 or 3 favorite looks?
Man, do I love this matchup for Stephon Diggs at $6,300 in this price tag. He's going to be on the outside. You expect him to see a fair bit of Richard Sherman, who, just coming off Achilles, a big challenge for Richard Sherman at this stage in his career to hang with these Minnesota wide receivers. They've got a huge implied total at 26. looks like a quarterback upgrade to me with Kirk Cousins from Case Keenum last year. So both Thielen and Diggs, in my opinion, are really, really underpriced at 6,900 and 6,300. I think those guys should both be in the sevens. I think they are very, very strong plays, and I think both have the kind of upside that you'd consider in tournaments and the kind of floor you'd consider in cash games.
I mean, are we going to talk about Chris Hogan at $6,100? Like,
Everybody's going to talk about Chris Hogan though. That's the thing.
But is there a point where he what's an ownership percentage where he gets so chalky that you wouldn't play him in the Millionaire Maker?
I mean, the early ownership percentages we have on him are ridiculous. The early ownership percentages we have on him are 30+%. And at that level, I'm playing other guys around him more. I mean, I obviously it's hard to see how the primary New England guys fail, given that you'd have to see New England unusually score low points because their offense is going to be so concentrated early in the season. That makes Chris Hogan an excellent cash game target for sure at 6,100. But I think of all the New England guys, I think he's priced most reasonably relative to his position. Whereas Gronk, it's hard to match the upside of Gronk, and there's not as many guys that you can kind of fit. A lot of people will pay down at tight end, certainly. And then Burkhead is cheap, and James White is cheap. So it's kind of hard to see how, those guys have less room for error in terms of failing. Whereas Chris Hogan, you could see a 5 for 65 game and he doesn't score. And at 6,100, he's beat out by a lot of other wide receivers. So I think Chris Hogan's an excellent play by all means. But when the ownership gets really, really high, he's the guy of the New England offense I'm most likely to take an underweight or a fade position on.
Mike, what do you make of Chris Hogan? You got Doug Baldwin in a perceived very bad matchup. You got that knee problem. Are he and T.Y. Hilton two pivots to look at here that are just going to come in at super low ownership?
So with Hogan, I'm same as Drew. If you're getting him at 25+% ownership percentage, I'm definitely going underweight. I know Leviton did a cool Million Maker series, which said you can have a chalk guy. In fact, most of the teams that won the Million Maker had one chalk guy. So I don't think you have to full fade, but it's probably plus EV to be underweight, maybe only own 5 to 10%. And the thing with Hogan's profile, I've been working a lot on these floor ceiling projections. A guy who's a high yards per target guy, who's making his value via yards and via touchdowns, not as much in terms of a ton of targets and a really high catch rate. The floor, isn't phenomenal. So even with us projecting him pretty favorably, given the lack of competition for targets directly at the wide receiver position for New England, we've got his 25th percentile outcome below Diggs, below Thielen, below a Larry Fitzgerald. I like Larry Fitzgerald, I think, more as a pivot than I do T.Y. Hilton or Doug Baldwin. I'm just sort of off this Seattle offense completely to start this season. Just concerns with their plan of attack from a coaching perspective, the offensive line. In Denver, Baldwin's not necessarily healthy. And then with T.Y. Hilton, there was some concerning stuff in terms of air yards per target for Andrew Luck in the preseason, that if you don't think, his arm is fully healthy and we're going to see a more toned down version, a more checked down happy version of Andrew Luck, where does T.Y. Hilton make his upside? I would take T.Y. before I took Doug Baldwin in this range, just because I feel more confident in fading this Seattle offense than maybe some of the stuff for Luck in the preseason was just completely fluky. And Hilton, we know, just has those insane high-end games to him, and I don't think ownership will be there.
Last two I wanted to talk about from this range, Mike. You got OBJ going up against the Jags. Very tough matchup, but he is supremely talented. And AJ Green is just right above him. It feels like Green is just falling into this dead range of pricing where no one really wants him, but he's playing Indy. This is a pretty sweet matchup.
Yeah, so AJ Green might be one of my favorite tournament targets of the week. We have him as a top 5 projected wide receiver. Of the guys up there, we have him with the lowest ownership projection. And this Indy defense is really weak at the cornerback positions. This is going to be a dome game in Indianapolis, which helps. Last season, Andy Dalton had 6.7 yards per attempt. He's been over 7 the previous 4 or 5 seasons. So expect some positive regression there. Expect some positive regression in terms of plays run for the Cincinnati offense. You've also got John Ross now on the other side, Tyler Boyd in the middle, a healthy Tyler Eifert. So while these are some competition for targets, it also should help the efficiency on AJ Green, just help the offense operate better as a whole. And I think that trumps the fact that maybe there's some competition for targets. And Indianapolis last year really did funnel targets to the receiver position. They were really weak at guarding the receiver position. So He's a guy that projects okay for us, but I really could see a high-end outcome. So I am very interested in AJ Green in tournaments.
What do you make of it, Drew? Do you like AJ Green as a tournament play, and would you even consider playing Beckham?
I do like AJ Green as a tournament play. Beckham, the price tag is really good at 7K, and it's the best price tag you'll get on Beckham all year long. So I'm okay with Beckham. I don't think he'd be like a primary play. If I was running like a tight core of wide receivers, he probably wouldn't make the list. But it's obviously a great price tag. It's just a very, very difficult matchup with Jalen Ramsey. So he's not like a huge exposure guy. I'd much rather have a big exposure weight to a guy like AJ Green or the Minnesota wide receiver.
All right, so this 5K range filled with names, but it seems like you're either going to pay up or pay down at the receiver position. We see this almost every week, unless there's just one weird outlier misprice in the 5K on DraftKings, that this range tends to go under-owned. People, and we see it at the running back position too. Like the difference between $4,800 and $5,300 isn't all that different, but in people's minds, they really perceive $4,800 as like a cheap value, and like 53 is a bit much to pay for X amount. Like this week, it would probably be Lamar Miller. Like I'll use Adrian Peterson at 47. He's way cheaper than Lamar Miller, although Lamar Miller is just a substantially better play. Probably worth the $500. In this range, you got like Juju, you got Josh Gordon, you have Demaryius Thomas, Devin Funchess, Will Fuller, Sammy Watkins, Leone's boy, Kelvin Benjamin. There he is. Crabtree, Landry, Corey Davis, the Colonel, Manny Sanders, Jamison Crowder. Like, these guys all seem, I mean, a few of them are boom or bust, obviously, like Will Fuller or Devin Funchess potentially, but this seems like a really decent floor range. Like, Drew, would you go here in cash? Would you go here in tournaments? Like, who are the guys?
My early builds in cash don't have me hitting this range, but if I was, the guy that I like the most in this range is Manny Sanders. He's had a great rapport in the preseason with Case Keenum, who targeted the slot heavily last year with Adam Thielen playing a lot of slot snaps. Manny Sanders is going to play a ton in the slot this year with Cortland Sutton and Demaryius Thomas outside. And 5K is a really good price tag. I know Seattle's slot corner is one of their better defensive weapons in the secondary, but I think Manny Sanders, that rapport he's built with Case Keenum early in the season, 5K looks like a really good price to me. In that range, also Jarvis Landry, I think at 5,500 is pretty interesting, just given the fact that we know Josh Gordon's not going to start. We don't know what that means from a snap count perspective and trying to project Josh Gordon. We think Cleveland's going to play in a game script that would make them make it necessary to utilize the passing game heavily. And we also think that, Jarvis Landry's been a target hog wherever he's gone. And we saw that connection in the preseason, whether you're watching Hard Knocks or whether you're watching the preseason games with Tyrod Taylor. So I think Jarvis Landry and Manny Sanders are my two favorites from this range. I haven't ended up in this range when building lineups for cash games early on, but those two guys would be the ones that have my eye.
What do you make of this, Mike? Is this a target range for you whatsoever?
Yeah, I like this range quite a bit. Maybe not a ton for cash games, as you said, just the nature of the way the builds turn out. But I like the same guys Drew does. And on the Emmanuel Sanders play, I like Demaryius Thomas as well. I really like this Denver offense in general. And it's probably a situation that in tournaments, I'm going to have a lot of lineups where I'm playing, one of Demaryius Sanders, Freeman. I don't think it's a situation where I want to stack, do any crazy triple stacks or anything like that. But I want a piece of this offense in a lot of lineups in a few different ways between those three guys, just because I think the Seattle defense is really overrated. I think there's a chance that Case Keenum is underrated. We'll find out with him, no longer in that great spot that he was in Minnesota. So I like that a lot. I also think you can make an argument for Jamison Crowder at 5K on a full PPR site. As a slot guy that we could see Alex Smith target quite a bit. We've got him projected just under 20% market share of targets. I could see that getting into, the low 20%, like 22 to 25% even. Jordan Reed, didn't play at all in the preseason. We'll see where his targets are. We'll see, the downfield threats that he has to throw to in Washington. They're not Tyreek Hill. So obviously he targeted Tyreek Hill because he was such an awesome talent and had such a great ability. I don't know if you see that out of Paul Richardson and Josh Doxson. So at least early on, I can see a lot of targets going the way of Crowder.
All right, so in this sub $5,000 range, you have like Garcon and Goodwin. They're both right there and do inherit a pretty tough matchup up against the Vikings. Kenny Stills is $4,700. We're still not sure if Devontae Parker's going to play or not, so that's kind of odd. If he doesn't play, he seems like someone you would want to pencil in right away. Even Danny Amendola at $4,200 on a full PPR site. The touchdown equity might not be there, but he could end up just playing the Jarvis Landry role if Albert Wilson doesn't, if Parker's out and he has to go to the outside, and he put Amendola into the slot. Is there anyone else in this $4,000 range that you're really into, or would you just drop down to the $3,000 level, unless someone like, I don't know, Michael Gallup at $4,000, if you want to take a gamble on him? Mike, would you play any of these guys?
I like Stills a decent bit, but in general, I just think there are equivalent type plays at sub 4K, I guess is the way I would put it.
Drew, are you on the same page with that?
I like these 4K guys. These are tournament targets for me. You mentioned Kenny Stills, who I think has a lot of upside to him if Devontae Parker is unable to go. They're just really wide receiver thin on the Dolphins. They're kind of like the Patriots in the sense that they just don't have a lot of wide receivers on the roster, so those guys are going to have to play a lot. And then I like, as part of like stacks or game stacks, Tyrell Williams for the Chargers, I think, has been way overlooked in the offseason because everybody is excited about Mike Williams making an impact this year. But Mike Williams was running with the twos often in the preseason. Tyrell, the only time he ran with the ones was when Tyrell was hurt. Tyrell practiced on Monday, so I think he's going to be healthy. And Chris Godwin from that Tampa Bay New Orleans game, if you're going to bring it back with a Tampa Bay wide receiver, Godwin at 4,100 is the guy that I'm most intrigued by. A really good physical skill set. Ryan Fitzpatrick had a quote last year that Chris Godwin was the most prepared rookie he had ever been around in his entire NFL career. So I think that speaks to a little bit of trust with Chris Godwin, because Fitzpatrick's been around in the NFL forever and on every single team, it seems like. So those guys are pretty interesting to me in tournaments, not cash game guys for me. I think, once you get below 4,000, you've got a guy that you're a little bit more interested in cash games. And then Amendola as well. I think similarly, just given, the wide receiver situations with the Dolphins. And I don't think people are going to play the Dolphins at all. So I think you're going to get really low ownership on these guys who have the potential for condensed market shares.
All right, so you mentioned a lot of these guys in the sub $4,000 level that you could potentially use in cash or even run out in tournaments, and where this pricing was really so long ago that it really opened up a lot of value. So I'm going to make a guess at who I think that your guy is here, Drew, and I'm going to bet it's Keelan Cole.
It is Keelan Cole. The Marquise Lee injury just opens up a lot of opportunity for the Jaguars receiving options. And Keelan Cole seems to be at the head of the list, both from a performance standpoint last year and an opportunity standpoint this year. He was running with the ones with Marquise Lee before the injury in the preseason. Jacksonville should be able to control the game. They have a high implied total against the Giants team that, is a lot healthier this year and has a lot more weapons on the offensive side of the ball, but still has a lot to be desired on the defensive side of the ball. Him and John Brown and John Ross, I think, are the three guys sub 4K that, really their values really stepped up quite a bit during the preseason. John Brown developed that rapport with Joe Flacco that was talked about by all the Ravens beat reporters. All systems go for John Brown. He's now healthy, no sickle cell issues early in the year so far. Good matchup against the Bills as well. And then John Ross was kind of that deep threat where Indy allowed so many deep balls last year and so many completed targets on deep balls last year. I don't think John Ross has a great floor because I don't think he's going to be a guy that's going to see 6+ targets, but I think his targets are going to be high value targets if he connects on one. And there's a huge amount of upside there at sub 4K.
Mike, would those be your three guys too? Because part of me just wants to play D.D. Westbrook over playing Keelan Cole in this spot, thinking that if Cole was running with the ones anyway, that's great. His role's not going to change. D.D. could come in and maybe not take over the Marquise Lee role, but at least take over some of his market share. And we saw games down the stretch last year where D.D. was piling up 8-9 targets per contest.
Yeah, the issue for me is just that Cole has been so much more productive on a per target basis than we saw DD racking up those targets. We saw the same thing this preseason. So I'm with Drew. No surprise, we work together, we make the projections together. So in some spots we deviate, but as far as the cheap wide receiver plays for tournaments, John Brown, John Ross are the two guys I was thinking of immediately when I said I'd rather go sub 4K. And even if I was going low 4Ks, it's Godwin, Tyrell, the big plays in okay game environments as well. Cole Beasley as maybe the guy to use for a PPR guy instead of Danny Amendola at $3,600 there. I don't think anyone will play, but other than that, not a whole ton of deviation. If you want to talk yourself into this Jacksonville pecking order being a bit different, Moncrief or D.D. Westbrook you could use, but I think that might actually be like a low-key good fade spot in tournaments with all those guys probably taking on some ownership with people trying to guess right. Cole, of course, taking on the bulk of the ownership there. And it just could be a situation where it might be an ugly game. If the Jacksonville defense does dominate, we could see a lot of Leonard Fournette. We could see the plays not as high as we're expecting. The Giants generally tend to inflate plays, but if the game goes a certain way, we might not see the play inflation that we're currently projecting.
Is there anyone on the back end of stacks that you would use here? Like if you're playing a Patriots stack, would Philip Dorsett get into that mix?
Well, if you're playing 150 lineups, I see room for Philip Dorsett to make the mix, but it's kind of betting on the pedigree that Philip Dorsett was a former first-round pick, as opposed to the fact that Philip Dorsett's been cut from different teams, and the fact that they just don't have a lot of wide receiver options, and he's going to be the one low-owned piece of the Patriots offense that you can get exposure to.
Well, let's say, Mike, you're playing a few Denver stacks. Would Courtland Sutton get into that mix?
I don't think so. The rookie receivers out of the gate, I'm a little bit concerned on. We just haven't seen the production on them the past few seasons. And when you've got a clear 1 and 2 wide receiver there, I don't think it's going to happen. The rookie wide receiver that might be interesting to gamble on is Traquan Smith, but you're talking about a guy that we have no idea how much he's going to play. Could be a complete zero, but really like his athletic profile, shined in the preseason. Of course, Cam Meredith had to play in that 4th preseason game because he was behind, because he was hurt last year. So I could maybe see Traquan Smith as a guy, but he projects really poorly for us in our initial projections, just because the volume's so uncertain and be kind of irresponsible to project too much volume there. But I could see things, I'd see things breaking right, I think, a bit more for Traquan early on than Sutton. They're both really good talents, but that's the way I'm looking at it.
I want to remind everyone again that Sunday morning on the DraftKings YouTube channel, I am going to be live in studio. We're going to do a bit of a show, then we're going to take all your start-sit questions, or at least as many as we can get to, 10 a.m. Eastern Time to 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Then DraftKings and the Boston crew are going to come on from 11:30 till kickoff on The Sweat, which you can watch right here on the YouTube channel, the DK Live app, or on the DraftKings Facebook page. Just want to remind everyone of that. But the first hour, the actual show part of the Pat Mayo Experience on Sunday mornings, will be available on your iTunes, on your Stitcher feed, probably around 11:15, maybe 11:30, depending on how we get it sorted out early on in the season. But you'll have the ability to have a pregame show on your iTunes feed ready to go for if you want to go to the gym before everything. What do you guys think about that? Isn't that hot fire? You just say yes.
You're getting fire. You're getting gym time in before lineups? I don't know about that. I don't know about that. I'll listen to you while I'm making lineups, but I'm not going to the gym.
We're going to go to the gym. Sometimes you Smiz does the anti-Tinker cast. Sometimes unless an injury comes out, I have my phone on me. I can make a global swap if I need to.
We're not gym guys to begin with, so that's.
Listen, you look really sweaty right now. I figured you just came from a run.
Dude, I've got this office that's just 1,000,000 degrees, and it's bad. It's bad news.
All right, let's talk quarterbacks. Anyone above $6,000 you want to play, Mike?
Not in cash games. I think this is a position. Well, I get $6,000. Philip Rivers in the low 6,000s is, I think, a really strong cash game play if you want to get access to this good matchup for the Chargers. We've got them at a pretty high yards per attempt. Strong amount of passing attempts as well. Decent team total. I think Rivers is good for cash games in general. I think it's a good week to go cheaper at the position, just because you've got Kamara, DJ, and even the better running back values are more like mid-high tier than they are really low price. That this is a position you can save and it won't really hurt you too much.
So what you're saying is that you're telling everyone out there right now to play Nate Peterman at $4,200?
That is not what I'm saying. That is probably, is that the cheapest quarterback we've ever had though that's starting?
It has to be, doesn't it?
Yeah, deservedly.
Is there a price you would play him at? Minus $3,000?
I would play him at $3,000.
Would you play him at minus $3,000?
Oh yeah, lock button.
So who is it of the cheap quarterbacks then, Mike, that you're looking at? Is it Fitzmagic? Is it Keenum? Is it any of those guys?
I feel like there, are a lot of ways you can go with the quarterback position. We have our value projections. Sometimes people get thrown off by the rankings of specific guys when we've got the value projection between a bunch of guys, like half a point of value between like Fitzpatrick. We've got Tannehill as a cheap option. I like Tyrod Taylor. I'm always a Tyrod fan with the rushing upside, and I think that Cleveland offense in general should be a lot better this year with the talent upgrades that they've made. But there's a lot of ways you can go. I hate to be non-committal. Initial look though, Fitzpatrick projects best for us, and we've sort of gone out of our way to make sure he doesn't over project, messing with the yards per attempt that we have for the baselines for Tampa Bay with Jameis Winston out. The pass run ratio. But at the end of the day, even if you expect this Saints defense to be pretty good, it's a spot where the pass attempts just have to get high in an environment that's good for offense in a dome there in New Orleans. And he's got weapons. You've got Mike Evans, you've got Chris Godwin, you've still got Deshaun Jackson there. You've got a couple of viable tight ends in the passing game. So Fitzpatrick is at the top of our list among the cheap quarterbacks at just $5K.
All right, Drew, for tournament play, it does seem like in the Millionaire Maker, everyone's going to own Brady, everyone's going to own Watson, everyone's going to own Breeze. But after that, it doesn't seem like any of the other quarterbacks are going to carry any sort of significant amount of ownership.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, when we were going through the range of outcomes projections, Mike was noticing and highlighting was the fact that almost every quarterback has kind of a similar 75th and 95th percentile outcome. There's a few guys that jump ahead, but in general, it's just hard to separate yourself at the quarterback position. So the best way to look at the quarterback position is to use the ownership as a way to separate yourself from the field. So kind of fade the chalkier owned guys and look for other guys. And if the other guys outside of Brady, Watson, and Breeze are all going to be lower owned, take your stabs there. And there's some guys that are cheap that you don't even need to necessarily stack at the quarterback position because they're so cheap that if they just got 202 and those two could be to random people, they could still have a tournament winning upside because of all the skill position players on the slate and the lack of there's a few good values, but it's not like a normal week one where you have a clear cut cheap running back that has bumped up because of injuries in the preseason. That's just a must play. It's not the same as the usual week one. So I think the quarterback position, there's a wide range of options that you could play. One of the guys of the cheap guys that our projections that nobody is going to play is Ryan Tannehill, who's just 5,200 or 5,300. And we talked about if they do have a condensed passing game with Devontae Parker out, he's even stackable because the other guys are so cheap and you can kind of build lineups around him. So I think Rivers is probably the guy that I'm leaning towards in cash, him or Fitzpatrick. But guys like Tannehill, guys like Kirk Cousins, guys like Ben Roethlisberger, they're all going to be under-owned in tournaments because all the ownership is going to kind of flow up towards Breeze, Watson, Brady, and maybe even Rivers a little bit. I could see Rivers being, among the highest owned quarterbacks as well.
Mike, would you dip into this sub $5,000 pool at all and play Joe Flacco?
I don't think. I just think there's so many decent options in the low 5K range at low ownership that I don't see anyone that I think, wow, that guy's really got a huge ceiling that makes it worth it. Flacco, I guess, you're hoping to run into some QB sneak touchdowns there. But, a lot of the guys Drew mentioned, what's nice about them too is they're very stackable. Even Sam Bradford in the low 5Ks, you've got Fitzgerald, Alex Smith, you've got Jamison Crowder, Jordan Reed, depending on how you think the market share shakes out there. Big Ben, of course, you can stack him in a variety of ways. Tannehill, Stills. I think all these quarterbacks are stackable. They're affordable, and they're not going to be that highly owned in the low 4K range or the low 5K range. So I don't really see, Peterman 4,200. Yeah, that's super cheap and nice, but he almost breaks our floor ceiling models because he's so low that the model almost can't handle him. We have him projected for 10 DraftKings points, which is a full 3 points lower than anyone else. So I know there's kind of a temptation to say, hey, this quarterback's insanely cheap, cheaper than we ever see a starting quarterback, but I still don't think it's worth it.
I remember for years when Cam was going through this slump, you guys would just play him every single week in tournaments, knowing when
Cam and Russ.
Yeah, just when the Cam upside hit, it was going to hit big. Maybe let me throw this out here to you, Mike. What if we're wrong about Denver's defense and it's not absolutely bananas good?
Yeah, I mean the price tag on Russ is good at 6,200. I think I'd rather just go naked Russ if I'm going to do that and take the rushing upside and not pin myself down to a specific target. If you feel good about Doug Baldwin's health, the price is good and you don't have Jimmy Graham there anymore to take the touchdowns away from the goal line. And Baldwin has been one of my favorite receivers, just given his talent over expectation over the last 5 years of the wide receiver model I ran. He's one of the best in terms of exceeding his expected catch rate, his expected yards per target, his expected touchdown rate. I just don't think this is the spot for it. So I'd rather go naked Russ if I was going to do it. I think naked Cam is fine. The Cam McCaffrey stack is interesting as well, because a lot of times people don't pair quarterback and running back together. Now that's not like a super bold move. People are going to pair those two, but it might not be as high as if it simply said wide receiver by McCaffrey's name instead of running back.
Yeah, so Drew, in terms of Russell Wilson, I'm just saying that like if Seattle's defense sucks and you get into a position where Denver scores a whole bunch of points, if you wanted to play like Royce Freeman, would it make any sense to play Russell Wilson coming back thinking he could either drop back 40 times to throw or potentially rush like 8 or 9 times? It just seems like the ceiling for him in this game. I will clearly admit there's probably no floor for him in this situation, especially with that offensive line against these pass rushers, but he's going to have to throw an awful lot here.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that when Mike was doing the range of outcomes at the quarterback position, one of the interesting things that we noted that Mike noted was the fact that the rushing aspect of the quarterbacks, we like to often think of it as providing a little bit of a floor, but it doesn't really show up in the floor projections in like the 25th percentile projections. Where it does show up is in the ceiling, in the 95th percentile projections. For example, like Cam Newton is like our 5th or 6th highest projected quarterback overall this week. But in terms of 95th percentile outcomes, he's our 2nd strongest quarterback option. Russ Wilson, sort of similarly, projects way down in our quarterback rankings this week specifically because of that matchup with Denver. But relative to all of his peers priced around him, he has a much better 95th percentile outcome. So I understand the play. I'm more likely to play Cam than Russ simply because of the opposing matchups. But that's the interesting thing to consider with these Russian quarterbacks is their ceiling does match up with the highest of the pocket passers, even in tough matchups, because they can run into those extreme rushing performances.
Let's switch to tight ends, and we don't need to really go through the entire slate of tight ends here. We just need to figure out who to play. So, Drew, are you paying up at all for tight ends?
Oh man, do I want to play Gronk? I mean, it's just such a sweet spot for Gronk with no Edelman. You're removing targets from Cooks and Amendola and Dion Lewis as well. Last year, you have a condensed profile in terms of the opportunity set for the targets. You've got a very nice price tag at $6,900. You've got the highest implied total on the slate. I would love to play Gronk. I don't know if I'm going to get there in cash games because, as usual on DraftKings, there are kind of puntable tight ends that are such stronger salary relief plays compared to some of the other positions that they often make kind of the cash game builds. But I plan to have a decent bit of Gronk in tournaments this week. I think he's one of those guys that, he's one of the few guys that reliably scores multiple touchdown games during the course of the season. So the upside on Gronk is just enormous.
Mike, are you going to be using much of anyone, Kyle Rudolph and up?
I think, Gronk in tournaments, just because of the insane upside that Drew mentioned, the price tag there, even if you were to compare him to the receiver position, isn't bad. So it's not like just a play because he's tight end. But outside of that, our value projections really push towards going sub 4K at the position. Jordan Reed at 4K, I think will be somewhat chalky because it is a lot of talent to get at 4K at this position. It's just kind of a situation for how comfortable are you with the workload. And if the public's going to bet on him a ton on that workload, maybe just go cheaper with some guys that might have similar upside. So I'm on David Njoku a lot for Cleveland. I think there are some fun, really cheap Cleveland stacks you can make, especially if you think Josh Gordon's somewhat limited and that opens up more targets for a Tyrod Landry stack, a Tyrod Njoku stack. But even outside of that, Njoku's a guy who had, excelled in college in terms of his dominator rating, his yards per catch, his breakout age, very athletic at the combine. Playerprofiler.com has his most comparable player in the NFL as Travis Kelce. So that's pretty high praise, even if you take it with a grain of salt. And at just $3,400, I think there's a lot of upside. We're projecting him as a top 5 value at around 7.8 yards per target. But he's the type of guy that I think you could see in the high 8 yards per target if things break right and with better quarterback play for Cleveland. another of the cheap options that's interesting. Ricky Seals-Jones was one of the highest tight ends in terms of yards per route run last season. I actually think of guys with 20 plus targets, he was the highest yards per route run. Now, he only had 28 targets total on the season. It was a pretty small sample, and the volume concerns for him are there, but no Jermaine Gresham. Week 1 for Arizona has him in a nice spot where those volume concerns are mitigated to an extent.
Okay, so the guys that I'm looking at, Ricky Seals-Jones is one of them at $3,000. The other two were, hey, if everyone's just real fired up for the Saints all of a sudden, my main man, Ben Watson's going to be sticking around the field, and he's going to be their primary tight end. Very smart fella, too. Great Wonderlic score, so I think that he could be a decent value at $3,100. The other ones were like Ryan Griffin. I didn't expect Steven Anderson to get cut by the Texans, so if Ryan Griffin is at full health, that's a part of that's a game stack everyone's going to be all over, and Ryan Griffin's just not a part of what anyone wants to do. Nick Vannett was another one with Ed Dixon out. I keep going back to that Seattle offense, but there's only so many pieces that I think have viability there. And if I mentioned, if Russell Wilson is someone who might drop back 40-ish times, running tight ends against Denver might not be the craziest thing in the world. And the cheapo of the week, I think, it looks like Blake Jarwin's running with the ones with Dallas. If that's the case, at $2,500, he could just be a target magnet for Dak Prescott.
Yeah, so some of those cheap guys are just guys that are unknown situations in terms of what kind of target volume they can command early. Talking about a guy like Van Nat, talking about a guy like Blake Jarwin. So they're definitely going to be no ownership on those, and they're cheap enough that they're worthy of consideration in tournaments. The guys that I like are a little bit more assured of their roles in the low threes and twos. Ryan Griffin, you mentioned, I totally agree with. Not only the Steven Anderson cut, but they lost CJ Fedorowicz from last season, and they also cut Braxton Miller, limiting their wide receiver pool a little bit from last season. They played a lot of 2 tight end sets last year, and they're going to have to throw the ball. And DeAndre Hopkins is going to be the focal point of New England's defensive attack. So Ryan Griffin at 2,800, I'm interested in as well. Jack Doyle at 3,600, I think, is interesting. The fact that Andrew Luck was not pushing the ball down the field is probably a positive for a guy like Jack Doyle, who's not going to get far down the field. And Cincinnati has excellent corners that kind of funnels targets to running backs and tight ends. That's one of the things that happens with Washington's defense as well. With Josh Norman on the outside, the fact that kind of funnels targets to the tight ends and the running backs, one of the reasons we like Ricky Seals-Jones. Mike mentioned David Njoku and Jordan Reed. I think in tournaments you can take shots at Tyler Eifert, who showed in the preseason he's not going to be a full-time player in terms of snaps, but he's going to run a ton of routes. I think he's interesting in terms of tournaments. Austin Seferian-Jenkins is a guy that I'm not sure where the market share is going to fall with the new team and with the wide receiver injury with Marquise Lee, but the Giants have historically always struggled against the tight end position. And Austin Seferian-Jenkins is a guy that, is a big body target for the red zone as well. So some of those guys are some of the cheap guys I'm looking at. You could extend it to George Kittle and Cameron Brate, who are borderline tight end 1, tight end 2 guys in draft season. Not the greatest matchup for either guy individually, but low price tags as well that can earn some consideration.
Well, Steven Anderson is now going to work out with the Patriots, so the Patriots are going to know the entire Houston playbook here by Sunday. So it might be tricky for Ryan Griffin from that sense, but I do like him a lot. I'm going to take a few shots with Jarwin, just on a full point PPR basis, just from what I saw in the preseason, the amount that he was playing with Dak, the amount of market share that he ended up getting, it was pretty substantial. And if they're going to be playing behind in these games, that someone on Dallas has to catch the ball, right? I'm not off on that. Someone needs to make a catch.
Someone does. My concern is that the offensive line injuries might make them have more tight end blocking situations. And then also, if he's out running routes, the matchup with Luke Kuechly is not particularly enticing at all. So I'm not on Jarwin. I understand that somebody's going to have to catch the ball for Dallas and they're going to have to throw the ball some. But it is difficult to figure out. I'm more likely to take my shots on the wide receivers than the tight ends, just because I'm concerned that the offensive line injuries early in the season might make them consider keeping tight ends to block a little bit more.
Mike, yay or nay on Antonio Gates?
Nay.
Nay? Yeah, I'm nay too. And I feel like I'm going to regret that when he catches 3 touchdowns.
Get him while he's healthy before the legs fall off.
Yeah, well, hopefully he's been where he hasn't been in the league. He's been off doing PEDs again.
Also a tough matchup with Eric Berry. So
yeah, he is incredibly cheap. I will say one other cheap guy I like is OJ Howard, who was over 11 yards per target last season. He had a 66% catch rate, not a whole ton of volume for him. But right now we've got Cameron Brate projecting within our top, just outside our top 5 values overall at about 13% market share of targets, expecting Howard to come in behind him at 9%. If you were to flip that, which reasonably could take place this year, given the draft capital in Howard, and as he matures a bit more at the offensive or at the NFL level, I think coming back on New Orleans stacks, he's a pretty interesting target.
All right, let's close this out. Week 1 defenses. The Ravens are the most expensive because they were playing the Bills, but now they're playing the Bills with Nate Peterman starting at quarterback. Over under 89% ownership for the Ravens defense week 1, Mike.
I'll take the slight under.
Okay. Are they too chalky to play, I guess is the question.
So I don't think they're too chalky to play in tournaments, but I do think you want to be underweight. And I know that probably sounds like a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I think there are some spots where you don't have to force yourself into being, okay, I'm either going to be overweight or I'm going to full fade. I don't think you need to do that. It's such a high upside spot. We saw the pick sixes Peterman threw in one game, and just more big picture, the Bills just don't have many receiving threats. They have an offensive line that projects to be one of the worst in the league. Things could very easily get ugly, but as a direct pivot play, love the Saints defense, opportunistic defense in the last season or two, and they're going to be home with a very positive game script. They've got a high team total, which does feed into the defensive touchdown projection for them a little bit against a quarterback in Ryan Fitzpatrick, who, he's not afraid to take some shots, and that can turn out poorly for him. And you can see the turnover side of things. So I think the Saints are really, really strong pivot in tournaments. If I was single entering, I would not use the Baltimore Ravens defense. So I put it that way. If I'm mass multi-entering, I'm still going to grab a piece just because the upside's so high for them.
So, Drew, Ravens are just objectively probably the best defensive play of the week. Are you going to the Saints after that as well, or would you drop down? I like the Titans at $2,900 as a defense no one's going to use.
Yeah, it's funny. We actually have the Saints projecting slightly ahead of Baltimore because of that defensive touchdown equity. So those two are our top defenses, with Jacksonville and Pittsburgh, the 3 and 4 defenses. So Saints for us make kind of a natural pivot when you're talking about really high ownership. In terms of cheap defenses, it is hard to find value on the defensive side. One of the defenses we actually like in our projections are the Patriots. And it's going to be interesting for tournaments since a lot of people are going to play Deshaun Watson and DeAndre Hopkins. The offensive line issues for Houston are going to be a big thing early in the season, and whether they can protect Deshaun Watson. The Patriots pass rush improved immensely over the course of the last season and into the offseason. So I think the Patriots at 2,400 are kind of interesting. Big home favorites. That's typically where you try to take advantage of defenses because the opposing team is going to be forced into passing situations. And Houston is a team that has always run a lot of plays, which gives a lot of opportunities for opposing defenses as well. We're also sort of interested in the Washington defense. They have a lot of defensive talent. They were injured last year. Sam Bradford's a guy that doesn't throw a lot of picks, but does take a lot of sacks. So Washington's defense at 2,800. Cincinnati's defense at 2,700 is my favorite cheap defense that I have the most confidence in. I don't know if I'll be able to get to up to them in cash, or if I'm going really cheap or all the way up to kind of the Baltimore New Orleans area. But Cincinnati, I really like taking advantage of. Indianapolis, they did try to address the offensive line with Quentin Nelson, but in general, the offensive line talent is limited and not that deep. And Andrew Luck hasn't been pushing the ball down the field. And Cincinnati's a really talented defense on the whole. I like Cincinnati a lot in this game. I'm actually surprised they're slight underdogs. I think the Andrew Luck power is a little bit overrated. And so I'm taking shots at Cincinnati, assuming that Vegas might be a little bit wrong on this situation, both offensively and defensively.
Well, I guess the thing with Cincinnati, though, is that without Burfict, how good is their defense going to be? He seems to be the cog that kind of runs everything. He stabilizes that defense. And when he's not in, they can be taken advantage of a little bit. But, Mike, the two that I want to throw out to you, Drew mentioned the Patriots, but, yeah, they have a terrible offensive line. But, the Patriots' offensive line has been pretty dinged up. You get J.J. Watt back at full health. You got a lot of attackers in that game that expects to run a lot of plays. The Texans' defense is only $2,200.
I can't do with it. The implied team total against is just so high. Brady is someone that is not throwing interceptions. I think Pro Football Focus has him as one of the lowest turnover worthy play guys in the league. One of the lowest interception rates in NFL history. He might actually have the lowest. and which is pretty incredible given the high upside type of targets or high upside attempts that he's making. But I can't get him bored on Houston. I think people really try to cop out on defensive spending, and given, if you get one pick six, you just get one thing fluky, it works out. But again, going back to that article that Leviton wrote for the DraftKings Million Maker, a lot of the teams that won the Million Maker were spending up on defenses, and that's generally because they're in the best spots, the most expensive defenses, and these are the defenses that have the most opportunity at generating sacks and really big play events. So I don't mind having a large chunk of my exposure to defenses coming from the Saints, the Ravens underweight, but still a little bit because of their upside. The Jaguars up there. I definitely think that's something that you can do. But the Carolina Panthers defense in the mid-tier is a strong one to target as well, just given the issues that Dallas could have and the type of game script that it looks like it's setting up for.
Yeah, that was the other defense that I was going to point out. At $3,200, Carolina was third in adjusted sack rate last season, getting to the quarterback at almost a 9% clip, which is kind of crazy. And if you do believe in that Dallas is going to have to pass and that line is beat up, that's just one that no one's going to play. So if we're going to just even save some money and pivot off the very, very top defenses, I think they have it basically in order here. Baltimore, Jacksonville, New Orleans are the three probably objectively best plays of the week. But that Carolina one I found super sneaky. You mentioned the Bengals. What about the Chargers?
Yeah, I think the Chargers are a great defense to attack in tournaments. Obviously, big pass rush upside with Joey Bosa. And obviously, even though the injury in the secondary, still super stacked secondary for the Chargers. And, a home favorite, that's usually where home favorites that can generate pass rush, that's where you want to attack. And the Chargers are cheap.
If you played the Chargers at $2,800, that's someone you would pair with Melvin Gordon?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think that's a fine approach. I am not as excited to play the defense running back stacks as a lot of people are, because generally when defenses go off, they need touchdowns. And when running backs go off, they need touchdowns. So until more of the scoring is weighted towards points allowed, I'm not as excited about running back defensive stacks than a lot of people are.
All right.
There is a positive correlation there still, though, but that is a good point.
All right, let's close this out with the final thing. And Mike, we'll start with you first. Who are your two favorite either game or team stacks of the week?
I'll just say I want a lot of the Denver offense. I guess I don't want a crazy stack, but I think that's where I'll have a lot of leverage on the field, is just in Denver players in general between Freeman, Sanders, and Demaryius Thomas.
All right, Drew, who is it for you that you're really going to be targeting either as a game or single team stack?
I think the Chargers and the Saints are the teams that I'm probably going to be targeting most heavily. But I think in terms of being contrarian, I'm pretty interested in Minnesota as an offense this week.
Say that again. Who is an offense?
Minnesota, the Minnesota Vikings. I think it's a good spot for the Minnesota Vikings.
Just a complete under-owned stack where you could have Cousins, Diggs, and Thielen, or potentially Rudolph?
Yeah, I think Cousins, Diggs, Thielen, Cook. I'm not in on Rudolph as much, but Cousins, Diggs, Thielen, Cook are all underpriced in my opinion, and probably going to be under-owned because they're such strong competitors at similar price tags. So I think that part of the offense just makes a ton of sense in tournaments.
If you had to bring back someone in that game the other way, because we didn't even really mention the Niners offense at all, would it be Goodwin over Garcon?
That's one where I kind of want to try to figure out the wide receiver cornerback matchups a little bit better. They're both really cheap, and they both don't need a ton with passing game targets removed from the Jerick McKinnon injury. So I do like bringing it back with one of those two, but it ultimately depends on who I think is Xavier Rhodes is going to be on.
Mike, do you have a preference between the two, Goodwin or Garcon?
Same as Drew. I think initially looking at some of the matchups, the cornerback receiver matchups on Pro Football Focus, their first run, they've got Rhodes on Goodwin, which would lead me towards Garcon. I do think it's a big deal if Rhodes is going to shadow, and who he does shadow, I'll just give me the other guy, quite frankly.
All right. That'll do it on the Pat Mayo Experience. Week 1, DraftKings picks coming up tomorrow. Full breakdown of week 1 from the gambling side of things with Jeff Feinberg and Tim Andakas. But guys, tell everyone once again about dailyroto.com and what that gets you.
Yeah, head on over to dailyroto.com. We've got the biggest thing is if you didn't watch lineup show that the three of us did together earlier in the offseason. Make sure to do that. But we've got an optimizer this season that is just really, really useful in terms of making your lineups, whether it's cash or GPP teams. It's very flexible. It's very fast. It has everything that you would want. And I think one of the most important aspects of any optimizer, we're really proud of the projections that we're putting out there that are the base of what you're optimizing your lineups off of. Drew's been spending a ton of time doing the nitty gritty in teams, like figuring out market shares and whatnot. I've been doing some back end stuff, figuring out floor ceiling projections. So we've got really cool tools kind of all integrated in this optimizer to help you have like this one-stop shop. But we also have a premium podcast and written analysis along with that if you want some more nuanced takes on how Drew and I are approaching the week.
Drew, anything to add to that about what you're really digging about Daily Roto this year?
Yeah, I think we're really excited about the additions and improvements we made to the optimizer, but also the floor ceiling projections are super helpful for generating tournament lineups and thinking about tournaments as a whole. So, use the promo code, the PME, get your 10% off and join us for the season over at dailyroto.com.
Exactly. Listen to the man. Use the promo code, the PME, get yourself 10% off. Also, subscribe to the Pat Mayo Experience audio versions on demand when you want them, uncut and uncensored. Bring me in your pocket. Bring me on a commute. You don't need to bring me. You need to bring the advice that the guys like Drew and Mike are bringing. All of a full complement of guests. The DraftKings show will normally drop on Wednesdays during the season. We thought we'd get it a day ahead of everything. And remember, the pick show on Wednesday, an injury update on Friday, and then live 10 a.m. Eastern time on Sunday. I'll be here taking your questions, previewing all the games, all the latest rankings updates, all the injuries, everything you need to know before lineup lock on Sunday. And that'll be available on demand very shortly after the fact. That you'll still have time to get it in before lineups actually lock. Anyway, I'm Pat Mayo. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience! Experience!